Good morning to everyone here with us today. We're very excited to have you all here. My name is Bijal Shah, Marketing and Trade Show Executive at Jade Global. Let me go ahead and start off by introducing today's session on best practices in implementing Hyperion Workforce Planning. I'd like to introduce Dan Fleming. He's Jade's VP of Client Services in the BI and EPM department here at Jade Global, and I've listed his contact details, dan.fleming@jadeglobal.com. Please feel free to ask him any questions. And again, I am Bijal Shah, Marketing and Trade Show Executive here at Jade Global, and also your moderator for today's webinar. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Dan now, who will review the agenda and continue on with the presentation. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Bijal. Good morning, everybody. Glad you could join us. So for today's webinar, I'm going to start with a brief discussion of what Hyperion Workforce Planning is, and I'll follow that up with a real detailed discussion into the Hyperion planning architecture itself, and then we'll have a walkthrough of the latest version, which is version 11.1.2.2. Then we'll move on to discussing some best practices in implementing workforce planning, and then the Jade Global EPM practice and our capabilities, and lastly, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So, on to the first section. What is Hyperion Workforce Planning? So, in short, it's a Hyperion planning module with pre-built functionality that's based upon best practices all around workforce-related expenses and how to forecast and plan for them. These are the expenses such as salaries, bonus, overtime, merit increase, fringe benefits, the ever-complicated payroll taxes in the U.S. and internationally. And this is all done at the employee level where it's linked to the overall planning environment within Hyperion Planning. So to really understand what all this means, because this is really sounds a little too much like a product brochure, let's talk about the architecture itself. So what you see here is just a typical Hyperion planning architecture. It has 5 different databases. Bear in mind, Hyperion Planning sits on Hyperion Essbase as the core engine. What we're specifically going to talk about today is over on the far left here, this workforce planning database. So let's begin with the bottom of the diagram and focus on the data sources first. How do we get data into Hyperion Planning? Well, financial planning database typically would have GL activity and balances within it. So your data source for that is going to be your company's GL. Yet the workforce planning piece is going to have HR-related data. So the data source for that would be if you have an HRIS system, directly from that. Many companies I see Excel being used as a data source for that. Back in the old days, the data sources were almost always flat files, but it's still possible today, and many companies still use flat files extensively in the data sources for Hyperion, but there are much more sophisticated solutions that can be used. For instance, you can pull data directly from Oracle EBS. But you could also source your data from data warehouses if you have an extensive data warehouse infrastructure, or other performance management applications. The Hyperion planning layer, this is the tool used to create all of your financial statements on a forecast, planning, or budget basis. So at this very bottom layer of it, this EPM architect, that is where the entire definition is created for Hyperion Planning. Things such as metadata and hierarchies. You can define your calculations, your KPIs, how you do allocations, driver-based allocations, or driver-based accounts. And of course, a consolidation of all of your forecast is done, defined within your EPM architect and done within these 5 databases that we have illustrated here. Think of this essentially, since this financial planning database houses and reports all of your financial statements because you have your GL account structure there. These other databases are almost or analogous to subledgers within a GL where they feed the top layer, the financial planning layer. And then at the very top, how do users interact with all of this system? Well, the user interface is something called EPM Workspace, and users will interact with Hyperion web forms, with SmartView, which is a Microsoft Office add-in where you can use Excel, PowerPoint, and actually all of the other Office products very seamlessly with Hyperion. And then there's a number of different reporting tools. Hyperion Financial Reports is probably the most prevalent, but there are other reporting tools as well that are available. So let's first talk about financial planning in a little bit more detail. So the core of this, as I mentioned, is Essbase. And Essbase is simply a multidimensional database engine, as opposed to a relational database, which Oracle is. So what does this mean? Well, what I've listed here is a typical dimensions of a planning application. So you've got scenario. That could be something like actual, budget, forecast, etc., depending upon how you have your actual forecast and planning processes set up. Version might be working version, past one, final. All of your different version controls of any given scenario are captured within that. Year is somewhat self-evident, the year you're in, and period captures all of the periods within your fiscal year. Typically, that would be month. Some companies might have that as a week, but typical is month, January, December. For accounts, as an example, are directly from your GL chart of accounts. So if you're an Oracle shop, that would be your EBS flex field segments. So you would have account, entity would be a legal entity in this case, department or cost center would be another segment. And I've included channel in this case. You have project or product as a segment. There's a certain amount of flexibility that you would want to incorporate in there. And then the last dimension is currency. What currency are you in? So this database, remember, is what's needed to create all of your financial statements from a prospective basis, forecasts, plans, budgets. So now let's talk about workforce planning and how that's in. So workforce planning, what you'll notice is the dimensions are very similar, however, with one key extent. We've got the employee dimension added here, and we've actually taken out the channel dimension in this case because in this example, employees are not, employee expenses are not captured at the channel level. Channel is only for revenue and gross margin in this particular example. So what we've done is we've essentially swapped out channel for the employee dimension. So workforce then, all of the planning is done at the employee level. Data is aggregated up the employee dimension and then typically moved to the financial planning Essbase database. So ultimately, do you need to have workforce planning deployed in order to forecast salary information? No, but if you want to do it at the employee level, yes, you need it. So let's move on to the walkthrough of the current version. And especially if you do have a custom solution, you'll get to compare and contrast some of the out-of-the-box forms and data navigation of what you would have if you had workforce planning. So here it is. This is version 11.122. And again, this is the user experience. What you'll notice in this version, even compared to the previous dot release, which was 11.121, they've made continual enhancements to the user experience. A lot of this navigation pane on the left was not as fully functioning in the prior version. So now they've continued, by they I mean Oracle, they've continued to make navigation easier for the user. Now notice there are a number of forms that we see exposed here. Forms 1 through 9, and then there are some below that as well. These are the basic out-of-the-box forms that come with Hyperion Workforce Planning. So we are currently on Form 1, Managing Existing Employee Status. So this would be the first thing you might do when you're dealing with workforce-related forecasting issues. So notice in this form you have all of your dimensions represented here so that you know what you're looking at. So the currency is local, you're on the budget scenario, first pass, the year is FY12 in this case, and it's a little harder to see, but grayed out here is the department you actually have selected, which is the Finance Department, Department 2200. So these are the active employees in Department 2200 right now. Now, the FP&A analyst who has responsibility for this department, they happen to know that Eddie Adams is going to be leaving the company in May. So what they would do is they would select May and select departed for that person. And as soon as that is done and save is selected, all of the financial impact of Eddie leaving the company in May will be fully comprehended in the financial planning database so that if you run financial statements, you should be able to see in headcount reports and your financials and OpEx reports that Eddie is no longer in the company May going forward. So when Eddie leaves, you realize that there may be some additional expenses that are related to his departure. So what the analyst does is they select to edit related expenses, and now notice we have Eddie Adams up here in a selection field. So we're forecasting specifically for Eddie Adams, and we're going to select departure costs. So this might be severance or different companies, things differently of course, but these expense categories down the left column would be could be mapped one for one to any GL chart of accounts. And we're entering $10,000 in a severance cost. And then once we hit enter, of course, it's saved. So now we've done everything we know that's coming in Department 2200 on the workforce side on the existing employees. So we've done our managing of existing employees. Now we know that Eddie needs to be replaced. So let's go to Form 4, which is selecting new hires. And we'd want to add a hire. This is going to be a salaried person. And as soon as you select that, a large number of properties come up that will define the person's compensation. And this is where every company forecasts slightly differently. And this is what you're looking at right now is out of the box, but typically companies heavily tailor this to their own specific situation. So again, this is kind of built upon best of breed, best practices for any given industry, but they may not be able to your specific industry or your particular company. So we've entered this person to start in June. And then once we hit add down here in the bottom, what you'll see is you have a row here that has all of the detail we just entered. It's called to be hired 1. If we had a second or third person, it would be listed to be hired 2, 3, etc. Their position and when they start, etc. So now what we might want to do is, all right, we've entered this, now employee expense summary. Let's look at that. And what you see is they have expenses starting in June, which is when we had that person start. And the calculation is done through the S-based calculation engine of healthcare costs based on the parameters we put in. All of the taxes are captured. This is a U.S.-based person. So you have Social Security tax, Medicare, SUI, FUTA, all based on the parameters that the system administrator puts in so that you keep control of your process. So you've gotten a brief taste of what the user experience is. Now let's go back and do a recap of what that Hyperion planning architecture looks like again. So we've done all of this work at the Hyperion planning level, at the employee level, and again, that data gets aggregated up the employee dimension and moved to the financial planning database so that instantaneously or real time we can create financial reports, we can create OpEx reports, we can create headcount trend reports by department. As soon as those changes are made at the department level, by employee, by all of your analyst community, those changes are felt instantaneously real time at the upper level. So in summary, I'm going to go through all of these different items. The first one is leveraging your out-of-the-box functionality, which you saw through the walkthrough that we did. Maximize the utility of workforce planning. And number 3 is workforce planning is for financial planning, with emphasis on the planning. Number 4 is design a technically sound architecture, which might sound obvious, but I'll get into details later. And number 5 is choose your workforce planning accounts wisely. So let's move on to the first one. Leveraging the out-of-the-box functionality. This is essentially a build versus buy decision where you're buying a product so you don't have to build it from scratch. If you recall our very first poll question, most of the respondents said they have a custom employee database. So that's the build approach. So when you buy workforce planning and you deploy it, bear in mind that the functionality is based on industry best practices, and you should try to make as changes as possible to, since the out-of-the-box forms. And it's important really for your system integrator and your consultants to understand how the out-of-the-box accounts are created or why they're created, why they're there, and how the calculations work before they make any changes. All too often, what I've seen occur is workforce planning is deployed, and then the consultants come in and quickly dismember of that functionality and essentially reinvent the entire wheel, which would be similar to building a custom employee database. Remember the build versus buy. I mean, the reason to implement workforce planning would be to shortcut the time it would take to do a custom database and rely upon some of those industry best practices. So don't deploy workforce planning to simply build the functionality from scratch. The second best practice is maximizing the utility of each S-based database. So what do I really mean by that? Stated differently, only deploy workforce planning if you benefit from it. Again, it sounds a little obvious, but remember the overall architecture we reviewed? It showed 5 different databases. Every additional database that you have in an overall Hyperion planning solution is going to add complexity, cost, and money. So you want to try to keep it as simple as possible while still achieving an effective forecasting solution. So in order to do so, you need to ask critical questions, and you need to be ready to answer them honestly. So the question is a simple one. Does your company's headcount change rapidly? Are you in a fast growth mode, or perhaps the opposite, where there's that need to really understand your headcount-related expenses? And your current processes, do you actually currently plan at the employee level, perhaps in Excel? If the answer to either of those is yes, workforce planning makes perfect sense for you. You're not going to be changing your processes that significantly, and you would really benefit from having that additional insight from workforce planning. If, however, on the other side, you are in a static stage in your company where your headcount-related expenses do not change month over month and are easy to forecast because it's always $1 million a month, then you're not going to get any benefit by implementing workforce planning. Never lose sight of the end goal, which is an effective process to create an accurate forecast of your financials. So you want to minimize your solution complexity in doing so. The third best practice, workforce planning is for financial planning. And again, the emphasis is on planning, which may sound obvious, but I'll tell you what I mean by that. The out-of-the-box functionality for workforce planning is specifically designed just around your forecast processes. Again, it's a planning tool. So it's designed to accurately forecast all of your employee-related expenses on a forward-looking basis. It's not designed to track historic actuals. That's where traditionally a BI solution would come in, looking at actuals, interpreting, understanding your actuals and how they've changed over the course of time. What I've seen, however, is many companies come in and try to make Hyperion Workforce Planning do both, which can work. So I'm not saying it cannot work, but it requires extensive modification to what comes out of the box. So, so you just need to be cognizant of that as you go in to undertake a project with Hyperion Workforce Planning. And also, bear in mind, do you have a corporate data warehouse strategy? If you do, perhaps you would want to design that historic employee level reporting from that data warehouse that you're going to be building. So historic information, quite simply, is, in my opinion, best captured from a relational database, a relational data source, whereas your planning activities are best accomplished in your S-based solution, your Hyperion planning solution. So clearly delineate what type of information comes from what source in the easiest and best overall solution. Number 4, design a technically sound architecture. While this, again, sounds very obvious, I would say about half of the implementations that I see that I walk into that we have not done, implementations have got this a little bit wrong. So remember our architecture diagram and how data gets from the workforce planning database to the financial planning database is very critical. The best practice in moving data is to use one of these functions. Typically, it would be it's called an xref function, or similarly, there's a function called xwrite to move data from workforce planning into financial planning into a stored account in financial planning. The other way to do it, which I see about half of the time, is to have dynamic calculations between these two S-based databases. Not advised. It creates data that is not quite reliable, and the person who's designing it that way has to have a very, very thorough understanding of the calculation order within S-base in order to do it properly. So the best practice is to not do it with this dynamic calculation between databases. Do it with a stored account in the financial planning database where you're moving data from workforce planning with an xref. You'll have reliable information from which you can do driver-based calculations, allocations, and other things within the financial planning database itself. So in short, system architecture really does matter. So make sure that the folks who are doing an implementation for you understand that. The 5th best practice, choose your workforce planning accounts wisely. So there's a rule of thumb here, and this creates some confusion because people, you should think of, from an end user perspective, Hyperion Planning is a system. And the fact that it has multiple S-based databases might not really be that important to the end user, or they shouldn't necessarily need to care about that underlying architecture. But when designing that solution, you need to know what is employee related and what you want to forecast at the employee level versus what you can forecast at the department level. So for instance, workforce planning should only be used for accounts where planning is always done at the employee level. Things like salary, everyone gets paid a different salary. All of those other items, taxes are calculated on an individual basis. Some things, however, that are based on overall headcount in a department, let's say, for instance, allocations is a fairly typical one, where you might allocate facilities expenses over your entire site based on headcount. Well, that doesn't need to be done in workforce planning, even though it's headcount based. You end up storing a total headcount by department in the financial planning database, and that's where those driver-based can be. So choose what's done in workforce planning wisely, and then also understand what can be done in financial planning. So that'll help streamline your process so you don't try to do too much or more than what's necessary in the workforce planning database. So in summary of all of the best practices, the first one, leverage what comes out of the box. Understand what comes out of the box, and this is the buy in your build versus buy decision. Numbers 2, 4, and 5 really come down to understanding that underlying S-base architecture, which again is the duty of the consultants that you engage, and they should educate you to the extent that it impacts what decisions need to be made. And then number 3, never lose sight that the end game of this is to produce accurate plans and forecasts. So it's about planning. So now let me move on and describe briefly some of our capabilities and our EPM practice at Jade Global. So we offer a full suite of product consulting around different core technologies that are within the Hyperion framework. So you have budgeting, planning, and forecasting. This is Hyperion planning and all of its subcomponents, which would be workforce planning, which we've talked about today. Similarly, there's CapEx planning. There's project financial planning, which is a new release in the current version, in version 11.122. Public sector financial planning. And all of this, of course, comes with very specific issues around metadata management and its hierarchies. Financial consolidation, HFM, very popular tool. It built Hyperion. It built what has become of Hyperion, actually. FDM is a critical component of it. And, of course, metadata management falls in that purview as well. Corporate strategy, Hyperion Strategic Finance, we offer services in. And another thing I've listed under here, assessment of Hyperion architecture, and let me add applications as well. Reviewing existing implementations. Often when companies do things internally, for instance, if they do an upgrade from an older version, from 9.3.1 to 11.122, there may be performance issues that and as a result of that, if they do things internally, because they didn't quite understand some of the intricacies of doing of the architecture changes from one version to another. Reporting and analysis, we offer full services in all of the reporting tools offered by Hyperion, and we also have support and maintenance that we offer. There's certainly a trend today to have solutions in the cloud, hosted solutions on VMware. Hyperion has gotten better and better at performing in those types of environments, and we support that type of environment.
Yeah.